Hey everybody, this is Shane. I spent a lot of my time not sleeping very well, so I kind of got into ASMR videos, and I finally figured I might try to make one myself tonight, so hopefully you enjoy. What you're looking at is a map of the Holy Land, and I thought tonight we might talk about some of the locations that Jesus visited during his years on earth and his ministry. And we might walk you through location by location, and at a few of those key points I'll try to read some Bible verses to try to put a little bit of color into his life as he went along. So again, hope you enjoy. If you look at the map, you can see this first location, of course, is Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. I think we all know that from Christmas time, but it's kind of neat to see where it actually really is. It's not terribly far from the Dead Sea, as you can see, which I didn't really know until I started looking at this a little bit more closely. And of course, then what's interesting is after a couple of different things that went on early, Jesus actually went north and spent his boyhood in Nazareth. And of course, that's where he grew up and worked with his earthly father, Joseph, as a carpenter. So that's pretty cool to see. Quite a ways apart, Nazareth and Bethlehem. And I think we all know that that was a journey that Joseph and Mary had to make because, of course, being from the line of David, he had to report in there for taxation purposes. But if you take a look at the scale up here, what's that, maybe 2.5 inches is 30 miles. And you can see that again, Bethlehem all the way to Nazareth. So that's probably 60, 70 miles, something like that, which is a long haul on a donkey. So we can be glad that we don't have to do that nowadays. So that's where Nazareth is. And kind of the third area that I wanted to show you, and they list two possibilities for this, is where Jesus was baptized. So here's one site noted as Bethany beyond the Jordan. You can kind of see the Jordan River right here, which we know that Jesus was baptized in. The other site is here, again, Bethany beyond the Jordan, question mark. They're not 100% sure where that is. So two possibilities in that general neighborhood. And that baptism, of course, is described in the Gospels, but the one that I like to read from is Matthew. And so in Matthew chapter 3, verses 13 forward, it says, "Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, 'I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?' Jesus replied, 'Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness.' Then John consented. And as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. And at that moment heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, 'This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased.'" So, pretty neat there to go get the context. And then as we mainly walk through Matthew tonight, we'll find that in Matthew chapter 4, we learn about the temptation of Jesus shown here. Again, you can see the question mark because, of course, 2,000 years ago, so we don't know exactly where all these locations were. And then after that, the next one that I wanted to show you is again traveling north, this time just past Nazareth to Cana. where we learn that Jesus does, I think, his first miracle of his adult ministry there, where he's turning water into wine. So that's where that takes place. And so the next one on the map that I wanted to show is where he meets the woman at the well. And I'm kind of having a little trouble, honestly, right now finding that. Ah, there we go. In an area named Sychar. And so that's a pretty famous story as well, where he's sitting at the well and talking with the woman, and basically lets her know that if she knew who she was talking to, she would ask for the water of life. And then, after that, he starts basically preaching in the synagogue. He gets rejected. And he continues, I should have said he began earlier, but he began and then continues to call disciples as he progresses through his ministry. And then eventually we end up at the next location I wanted to tell you about, which is the Sermon on the Mount. And you can see, once again, there's a question mark, right? Is that exactly where it was? But the Sermon on the Mount, of course, is, one of his most famous sermons. And that's reflected in Matthew 5-7. And, there's a lot we could read there. He covers a number of topics and a lot of wisdom there. But I will touch on at least the opening verses in Matthew 5, which are the Beatitudes. And Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And of course, that's not every verse, but that's a few of those up front, just to give you a feeling for that. So, again, that's always with a question mark, but that's a possibility for where the Sermon on the Mount took place. So, kind of interesting there. And then moving on from there, and of course, as you realize, everywhere he goes, he's making a big difference and teaching and working miracles and just making a big impact on the world. But trying to highlight a few of these things that really stand out, not only on the map, but just to me. And so, again, I apologize. I have a little trouble seeing some of this while I'm working the camera, but right here, this area, just in general, lots of things going on there. But what's most interesting to me there is when he heals the centurion's servant, if you know that story. And that one is, I think, really good, because what we learn is that this centurion, who is, of course, a Roman soldier and not a Jew, is a very faithful person who believes in God. And Jesus ends up being astounded at his faith. So in Matthew 8, starting at verse 5, it says, "When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. 'Lord,' he said, 'my servant lies at home paralyzed and in terrible suffering.' Jesus said to him, 'I will go and heal him.' The centurion replied, 'Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it.' When Jesus heard this, he was astonished, and said to those following him, 'I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith.'" And then what we find is basically Jesus says, go ahead back home. Your servant has been healed. And sure enough, he was. So that was pretty cool. Again, you had somebody who was a member of the Roman army, but had more faith than a lot of the people that were of Israel. So that was pretty impressive. And then we can kind of take a look here, and you can kind of see that Jesus moved all over during his ministry. But the Sea of Galilee right here, a lot goes on there. And right here you can see that he walks on water and quiets the storm, and actually that's in reverse order. He quiets the storm first, so that's pretty cool. Again, that's the story of when he's on the boat with disciples, and I think he's asleep actually, and a storm comes up over the Sea of Galilee, and they get scared and they go to wake him, and he basically says, where's your faith? And then he tells the storm and the winds to be quiet, and they are. And the disciples are astounded, wondering who is he really with all this power. So that's pretty awesome. And that takes place in Matthew chapter 8 as well. And then the walking on water actually takes place in Matthew chapter 14. And of course, that's when Jesus actually walks out to the boat with the disciples, and he walks out on water. And Peter, expressing faith, wants to come out to him, and Jesus says, come. And Peter starts to walk out, but then loses faith, or maybe starts to get afraid and starts to sink. And of course, then Jesus, helps him in that regard. But in between the two, of course, is probably one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And that's the feeding of the 5,000. And so that's in Matthew chapter 14, as I think I was getting to, verse 13. And so it says, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You can give them something to eat. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Bring them here to me, he said, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So I've always thought that was a pretty awesome story. Pretty awesome miracle. So then, leaving there, really the next point of interest on the map is where they think the possible locations of the Transfiguration were. So here's one, all the way up north near Mount Hermon, rather. And then the other possible location is here, Mount Tabor. So you can see that, and that's considered the traditional site. But the Transfiguration is when they go up on a mountain as Jesus and several disciples, or a couple of disciples primarily, and Jesus is transfigured or changed basically to his heavenly glory. And he's seen there meeting with Elijah and Moses. And so that's a pretty huge thing, obviously. So a couple of the disciples, and Peter was one, certainly get that firsthand look at the fact that, definitely we're dealing with Jesus as a heavenly figure here, as the heavenly figure. So that's cool. And then after that, there's a whole lot that happens in his life, and he does many things that we won't really go into. But I want to go ahead and just talk for a minute about his raising of Lazarus from the dead. And I think we have that here toward the south, looks like toward Bethany. So again, you can see that area is in Judea and not very far from the Dead Sea, Salt Sea. So, and of course, that was huge because Lazarus was actually his friend, and he had gotten word that he had died. And so he was brought to that scene, and Lazarus had been dead and I think buried for quite a while. And Jesus wept and then went to call him forth out of the tomb and raised him from the dead. Huge miracle. So after that, we're getting very close to the last days of Jesus' earthly ministry. You can see here toward Jericho. Of course, Jericho, famous in its own right. A couple things go on, but the one that's noteworthy to me is Zacchaeus, who was a fairly small-statured man, wanted to see Jesus when he passed by in the crowd, and so he climbed up a tree, and Jesus called him down, and I believe went to his house as well. And then after that, of course, here is Jerusalem. Not long after that, we head into Holy Week, which was what I would call Holy Week, which is the Passover week and the last week of Jesus' earthly ministry. So, of course, he goes into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday by riding a donkey in, just like the prophecy had said. And many of the crowd put down palm leaves to signify the significance of that entry, the triumphal entry. And then he, again, ends up doing several things through that week. He has the Passover meal, which he then converts to basically the meal that remembers or signifies what's about to happen with his death and the breaking of his body and his blood. And then we get into eventually the crucifixion. So the crucifixion and resurrection, again, kind of pointing out in the Jerusalem area. And of course, we know that Jesus was crucified, and essentially, all through the Gospels, the case is building that the Pharisees and the government officials, they want to take Jesus out of the picture because they're basically losing power and credibility, and so they basically drive the whole situation such that he ends up being tried with the help of Rome and convicted and then sentenced to crucifixion. And so he's crucified along with two others. Those two are thieves, of course, one of which basically rejects him and the other asks for his help and salvation. And then he dies, of course. And he's buried. Joseph of Arimathea asks for his body, buries him in basically a fresh, nice tomb that he had purchased or had built. And a large stone is rolled in front. And I believe the Romans seal that with the seal of the emperor, or at least of the government, such that it can't be tampered with. And then within 3 days, of course, they find, and the disciples find, and the women, the Marys find, that that stone has been rolled away and Jesus is gone. And so, of course, we know that he was resurrected and lives to this day, of course. And of course, then he shows himself to his disciples thereafter for some time. And then finally, he's raised up into heaven. And there he remains today. And so there's a few different places where that's described, but the one I like that's interesting to me is Acts. And in the book of Acts it says, after he said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why do you stand here looking into the sky? this same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. And so Jesus was again raised into heaven, and that last sentence helps us know that one day he'll come back, and of course he'll collect us as that happens, as we believe in him. So that's pretty much it, guys and gals. I just wanted to walk us a little bit through some of the events of the Bible, the New Testament, and I thought it was kind of cool that this map showed some of the potential areas where these events happened. And so I kind of numbered those, and I went through a few of those, read you a few verses along the way, and hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully it relaxed you, and you learned a bit along the way. So that's it for tonight. Take care.